Our next speaker is a versatile and ambitious entrepreneur and electrical engineer with global experience, including designing electrical and lighting systems for iconic buildings in Melbourne, designing complex solar arrays and microgrids for Google campuses in the US, and with Engineers Without Borders supporting the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Energy Team in Ethiopia. Ruby Hurd is the founder of Alinga Energy Consulting, a socially conscious engineering consultancy that provides specialist energy services to the commercial, government and NGO sectors within Australia and internationally. Her company has a particular focus on areas where energy accessibility and affordability issues prevent or limit the availability of reliable power. With Indigenous heritage originating from the Jaru people of the Kimberley, Ruby is especially driven to find solutions for Indigenous communities. In 2019, Ruby was recognised by Engineers Australia in their 100 Engineers Making a Difference list and was awarded Young Professional Engineer of the Year in Victoria. Since 2021, Ruby's been undertaking a PhD at the University of Melbourne on responsible and sustainable energy solutions in Indigenous communities, and her interests include exploring what an energy system would look like if it was based on traditional Indigenous values rather than Western principles, and investigating the barriers to implementing sustainable community-centred energy systems. This complements Ruby's role on the steering committee of the First Nations Clean Energy Network, where she works towards promoting best practice in engagement and benefit sharing for Indigenous people through energy projects. Ruby will be presenting on solar and First Nations communities, opportunities and challenges of the clean energy transition.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about remote community, the status quo of energy. I realise not a lot of people who don't work in this space know a lot about how energy is distributed and used in our remote communities. I'll talk about the opportunities of the energy transition and how, that's a different note, this is a different presentation. My goodness, my goodness. All right, that's okay. We just won't read those notes. Okay, so yeah, I want to run you through the household energy consumption in a typical Indigenous household that's living out in community. We'll talk a bit about the systemic disadvantages that are influencing this high energy usage, about the dirty and expensive methods of generating power for our communities, specifically looking at solar, what are the opportunities and barriers, and what's being done in this space moving forward. So for this part of the presentation, we're going to do this storytelling style. I know it's been a long day, but keep in mind this is not a bedtime story, so please try to stay awake. Okay, so imagine this is you and your daughter. You live in a remote Indigenous community in Western Australia. This is your prepayment energy meter. To have electricity in your home, you need to have credit, so it works like a prepaid phone. You get credit by purchasing a physical card from the local shop and applying it to your meter. Your meter shows how much credit you have remaining and nothing else. You have to estimate how long that money is going to last you. You have a busy week, you forget to check your meter, and your power turns off while you're cooking dinner with your electric stove. You go outside to where your meter is and realise that you've clicked over to and expended your emergency credit. The shop is now shut, so you can't buy a power card. Your options are to, 1, knock on your neighbour's doors to try to borrow a power card if they have any. 2, have your neighbour throw an extension cord out to you so you can power some of your essential loads. Or 3, go without power till the morning. Cook outside on a fire, sleep outside because it's too hot in your house without fans or air conditioning. And maybe your neighbour will put on their porch light so that you can see a little bit. Meanwhile, your fridge and freezer are warming up. You have an old appliance that desperately needs new seals, so it's not staying cool without power. So your food's going bad, and you have refrigerated medicines that are also degrading. Your home is so hot that your cupboard food items are also being impacted, and no one gets a warm shower tonight. You have a poor night's sleep outside, where you have to worry about your family's security and how this all impacts your health and well-being, your child's ability to perform in school, your ability to work and maintain a happy family unit. So thinking about that and comparing that to how you use energy as a person who lives in a town or a city, just ask yourself, does that feel equitable to you? So this is a significant problem that's impacting a lot of our Indigenous communities. That's a very typical story. Not all communities are subjected to that kind of prepaid metering, and some have functionality where they can purchase online, but that represents 100+ communities in WA alone. All right, now the interactive part of this talk. First 3 rows will get wet. Who knows, hands up, who knows how much, on average, how much energy they use in their household, kilowatt hours per day? All right, a few people. Keep your hand up if it's less than 40 kilowatt hours. Less than 30. Less than 20. Less than 10. All right. Oh, all right. Well done. Well done. Pretty low there. So the average consumption in Victoria is 22 kilowatt hours a day, depending on which resources you look at for that information. So yeah, we had a fair few people kind of dropping out around there. Victorian households with solar, about 19 kilowatt hours a day. There's the national average of electricity bills, and in Victoria, you're about 22% lower than that. This data is from a community that I've worked with in the Kimberley. It's about 10 kilometres from Derby, and they're connected to the Derby Horizon Power Network. The average consumption, when we looked at their data, this is about 70 households, and we just removed a couple of outliers that had very low consumption because they were often away from home. 38 kilowatt hours a day, so it's pretty high. So that means Mulwinjum households using 74 to 100% more energy than Victorian households, and their bills about 186% higher than the average in Australia. So now talking through some reasons behind this very high usage. A lot of it's to do with systemic disadvantage and things that can't be changed. So the first thing is we have severe housing shortages. I realise that we have housing shortages all over Australia now, but specifically in our Indigenous communities, we've been having this problem for a long time. And so what that means is that houses tend to be very overcrowded. So there's more people living in them than average. Census data says it's about 3.9 people per household in Mulwinjum compared with 2.6 people in Melbourne. I would say it's even higher than that because Indigenous communities, we also have a very transient population. A lot of people coming in all the time and staying with family. Next problem is climate. So you can see in this figure that we expect our regional and remote places, especially in the interior of Australia, to be subjected to a disproportionate temperature rise due to climate change. It's already very hot in the regions where most of our Indigenous communities live in the top end. We also have very poor housing there. So the houses are quite old, but even when they were newly built, they were built badly. So, not many energy efficiency measures and really not appropriate for the climate whatsoever. This is a scorecard assessment that was done in tropical places. They found that the housing ranged between 2 and 3 stars out of 10 stars. We also have really inefficient energy appliances used in our households, and there's not a lot of access to anything better. So some of these communities that I work with are about 8 hours drive from Broome. So the only place that they can really get upgrades easily to any of their appliances is that one shop in town that sells the power cards. And that one shop is only stocking very limited things, and usually they're going for the cheapest items, not the most energy efficient items. And we know that the efficiency of the cheaper item is often worse. There's also a big energy literacy problem. So they don't really understand how to limit their energy usage often, and they don't understand the Energy Star ratings that are on our appliances. When I interviewed people in the Kimberley, they didn't know what those Energy Star ratings meant at all. They also don't have any access to any historic or real-time data. So where you can just pick up your bills and look at that, or you may, be a bit more savvy and have the ability to look at some real-time data or some hourly data, they don't have any access to that. So they're really limited understanding of their energy usage. And there are more. So no retailer options. I put this graphic together. It shows how many retail options you have depending on where you live in Australia. So you see in Melbourne, about 28 retailers. If you live in WA, Northern Territory, or Queensland, you basically have no retail options whatsoever. So, no way to shop around and get a better deal for yourself. Many of our communities are run on 100% diesel generators. So they're further contributing to climate change, but have no other option but to do so, because there's often no access to rooftop solar power. And there's a few reasons behind that. One of the key ones is that generally no one in community owns their own home. They're all community housing. So they're not allowed to put solar on their own roofs. There's also an issue around the prepayment meters, where only recently did the first customer of a prepaid meter was able to get a solar system installed, because there was just no process even around how you would go about it. So it's not necessarily a technical problem, but more of an issue with the utility, that they just didn't have any mechanisms to make it happen. And the last one there is lack of capital. So we're talking about areas where there's a lot less opportunity to make money. And so households don't have a lot of money stacked up to invest in something like solar, and solar also costs a lot more out there as well. We talked about the self-disconnection by prepayment meters. That's what they call it. They call it self-disconnection, as if you voluntarily chose to be disconnected from your power. Here, disconnection is the very last thing that the utility or the retailer want to do to you. They try to do everything to avoid you being disconnected. You can go on a payment plan, they'll let you be overdue. But literally in the communities, it's the first thing that they do is disconnect your power. And the last one there is tariff equalisation. And tariff equalisation, it's good in a sense, because it says that if you are in a place where it's very expensive to supply you with power, because you're using diesel generators, you won't pay any more than anybody else in the state, and you're subsidised by the other people on the network around the state. But that's a form of equality and not equity, and I think that equity should be our goal. Okay, dirty and expensive generation. So many communities, not all of them, but many are running on diesel generators. And some of the communities I've worked with are using between 600 to 1,000 litres per day. And that's really just to power 30 to 40 homes. They might have a small school, a shop, a health centre, a couple of community buildings, that sort of thing. So it's a lot of diesel being used out here. The levelized cost of energy, or the cost to generate, is well over 60 cents. I mean, with the price of diesel now, I'm not sure what it is, but it could be over $1 in some communities before all these diesel price rises. So it's very expensive. And because of that, the Department of Communities in WA, they lost about $150,000 per year per community. And they had over 100 communities that were being run off diesel in this way. So there's a lot of money being lost, and it's a lot of our money. That's taxpayers' money. And when I asked the Department of Communities why it was that they didn't invest in solar, because, hey guys, it's 2021, and we know that solar provides a much more economical option, they said it was a budget problem. They have an operational budget, and they do not have any capital works budget. So they had no money to improve the system. which is just a pretty ridiculous reason to not invest in something that's going to save so much money and carbon emissions. All right, so now some of the opportunities and barriers specifically around solar in communities. So you'll see this is the solar installation or irradiation levels in Australia. There is world-class solar resources specifically in our communities. So it makes really, really good sense to use solar out there. I mentioned before, clear cost savings for PV compared with diesel. I'm sure you know what the cost per unit is for generating with solar, and it's well below that 60 plus cents that I mentioned before. Solar PV tends to be more appropriate than wind in these communities just because of their size. So I found that we're looking usually at putting in solar of maybe a couple of megawatts. And at that scale, wind just really isn't cost competitive. There's just a real lack of products that are available around that size. So the cost per kilowatt hour just doesn't make sense for these communities. And with such a good solar resource and potentially not a great wind resource in many of these places, it tends to beat wind out every time. Solar PV is the option that gives direct benefits to customers. So I mentioned the tariff equalisation scheme, and so there's two parts to that. One part is that you as a customer won't be shown the true cost, or won't be charged the true cost of delivering power to your area. But the other part to that means that as the utility, they get subsidised no matter how much it costs them to generate power. So there is absolutely no incentive for the utilities to generate power at a lower cost. So that's a real issue, another issue with them putting solar in. Communities are generally really supportive of renewable energy technologies. Maybe don't use the word renewable energy. It doesn't really seem to be recognised out in community, but when you explain that it's solar or wind turbines, they're pretty supportive of it because they do understand that it is less cost energy. We're also looking at potentially new jobs going into community, especially with rooftop solar around the installation and the maintenance of them. So there's a really good opportunity there to bring jobs to a place that's really struggling to find work for people. And the last one, self-determination and control. So it's fantastic to be able to give people a little bit of control over their energy usage through rooftop solar. So some of the barriers. So over the last few years, I've been working on feasibility studies in communities in the Kimberley. And two of those were isolated diesel networks. And so very quickly, I found that there was a big issue in these isolated networks with hosting capacity. And so what happened with a couple of these communities was that even before looking at any solar exports from rooftop solar, the solar systems were driving the load down below the minimum loading point of the generators. So putting solar on these networks, you have to be really careful you're not going to cause issues for the generators. And if the utility thinks there will or potentially could be any issues, they're really not going to be supportive of solar going in. So that's a bit of an issue that has to be addressed. So either, by putting more appropriately sized generators into the community, or to be able to dynamically manage the solar output to avoid dipping the generators down. You can see here, these are a couple of graphs of those communities that I just mentioned. So that's the average household load. And you can see that there's very high nighttime energy use. And that's associated with using air conditioning overnight because it's so hot out there. So that doesn't, it's not the best curve we'd like to see to match up with solar output. I mentioned residents don't own their own houses, so quite difficult to put solar on the rooftops. And sometimes the houses, they're not in good enough quality or condition to actually put rooftop solar on. So potentially needing to look at ultralight solar to go on some of these roofs where that's an issue. We really need to pair solar with energy efficiency measures to get the best value. So, you know, these houses are just no point putting air conditioning in and just having them leak like sieves, right? So we'd like to see programs come in that aren't just focused on solar, but are also focused on improving the housing, not just so that they work more efficiently, but so that they're more comfortable as well for people. I mentioned already high costs and lack of capital. That's a significant barrier. But what we could show on those two isolated networks, we showed that even when we did rooftop solar, so I'll back it up. We looked at 3 options. We looked at rooftop solar for all the houses. We looked at a centralized system that would be owned by community or by some other third party. And we looked at a system that could be owned by Horizon Power. So I said before, there's a bit of a split incentive. If Horizon Power reduce their cost of generation, they don't pass any of that onto the customer. So it doesn't get the best customer outcomes. And it gives us the biggest systems though, and the largest renewable energy penetration. When we looked at household rooftop solar, where were they going with this? Oh, when we looked at rooftop solar, Horizon Power still had a significant cost benefit from that because they were losing money for every kilowatt hour that they sold or every kilowatt hour that they generated anyway. So those savings were so significant that they could actually pay for the rooftop solar on everyone's house and still have money left over. And they could then buy a community battery to capture that exported solar and still have money left over. So, you know, it just ticks all the boxes and makes so much sense. But we can't have households paying for their own solar necessarily. I mentioned the lack of pathways with utilities. So, you know, they haven't figured all these things out yet. Ergon Energy has been doing a trial to look at integrating solar into their isolated networks. So we're moving towards it. Mentioned the lack of incentives for utilities, and the last one, cyclones and vandalism. So there are cyclone rated panels out there, but that's not always what the installer installs, and many of these areas are subject to cyclones. So we just need to make sure that installers aren't coming in and convincing people they should buy the wrong products. So what's happening moving forward? This is 14 community-led energy projects. So it's really good to see that Indigenous communities are being proactive at starting up their own projects. That's what we'd like to see moving forward. There's a Kimberley energy efficiency upgrade that's proposed by the WA government. So that'll affect housing across a number of communities and hopefully be just a pilot study that can then be rolled out more widely. There's been over 10 feasibility studies done for Indigenous communities through the Regional and Remote Communities Microgrids Fund by the federal government. And there's plans for household solar to be rolled out to some WA Indigenous communities as well. And then just quickly, I know I'm running out of time. I'm on the steering committee of the First Nations Clean Energy Network. So this was established in 2021 by myself and some other First Nations leaders with various backgrounds. But we have a common goal to empower First Nations communities to participate in and drive an equitable energy transition. So we've been doing a lot towards this. We just took 30 First Nations people from around the country to Cairns, and we did an intensive program of a week long of learning about energy. So we'll see some First Nations leaders coming out of that. We've come up with best practice principle guides for industry. So when they're approaching Indigenous communities about projects, things we'd like to see. We've created negotiation guidelines to help community negotiate with big renewable energy proponents that are coming to them. We're working on a community energy planning guideline as well for projects that they'd like to start themselves, and working on a strategy, a job strategy in partnership with UTS. Oh, that's it.
Thank you, Ruby. We've got time for a couple of very quick questions. Anna?
Quick, easy questions only, please, folks.
Thanks, Ruby. That was really interesting. I just was wondering about that rooftop solar on those small isolated communities. Does that present more of a problem for managing the minimum load on the diesels compared to a centralised PV system?
Yeah, definitely. So that's, I mentioned that Ergon's working on a trial. So they're looking at using switched in components to try and dynamically manage. And I've seen it done for like over 50s living villages as well that have, you know, a gate meter. So they need to do something similar. So yeah, it adds complexity, especially with the limited communications that are out there as well. And obviously adds cost. So yeah, from that point of view, centralized is a lot simpler, but also I think when we looked at cost, it tends to be more expensive because you have to build concrete foundations and the rooftops are already there.
One more question?
When you said that the issue of the no home ownership affects the communities as it does in general, all the Australian residents, are you thinking of a government subsidy of sorts or of a solution that tailors the sort of a, I don't know, have you got any ideas? Thanks.
Yeah, well, like I said, we looked at how much money the utilities would be saving, and so there's a clear business case or business proposition to say that they should be or could be purchasing those systems themselves. They also have, you know, a better point to negotiate with the housing providers and with the government because there's kind of overlapping interests. It's not just the Aboriginal housing provider, it's the Department of Communities. They act as a landlord. It's very complicated. So yeah, I would say that using the utilities, and these are government owned utilities anyway, so government subsidy is definitely on the table.
And I'm going to squeeze in a last quick question. You talked in terms of the First Nations network, you talked about best practice for negotiating or helping communities negotiate with utility companies building large-scale systems. Is that part of the solution? Like those, because you know we've got these new reverse auctions. There's going to be loads more big solar farms. Are those part of the solution? Just not obviously to power those communities, but as part of those negotiations to bring these communities up.
Yeah, well, we're looking at, so there's so many opportunities with these large-scale projects, opportunities for jobs, opportunities for Indigenous procurement, and opportunities for getting equity stakes and other revenue options from that. But yeah, the one thing that often communities ask for is they say, oh, well, does this mean that we'll have cheaper power? Yes. And that's not just Indigenous communities, that's regional communities as well. And the answer always seems to be like, no, no, that's off the table. And it's, you know, it's like a voltage issue really, because they're just kind of bypassing the community and going straight onto the transmission network, which is obviously very hard to explain to have a community accept that. But yeah, we are working towards communities understanding what it is that they can ask for, what other communities might have gotten in negotiations, and with the idea that we could get these wider benefits outside of energy.
Thank you, Ruby.